Venezuela's sub versus the USS Gerald R. The incident that could ignite a new Cold War. Let me take you back to July 17, 2024, a date that, if you're like most Americans, you probably don't remember. That's because the Pentagon, the White House, and the major news networks treated it like just another routine naval exercise. A Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, allegedly shadowed the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group in the Caribbean. The official story? A harmless encounter, a minor blip in the long history of U.S. naval dominance. The Ford, we were told, detected the sub, tracked it, and sent it on its way without incident. Case closed. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying naval warfare, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. And let me tell you, this wasn't just another routine patrol. This was a deliberate provocation, one that reveals far more about the state of global power than Washington wants you to know. I'm not some armchair analyst with a YouTube channel. I've advised defense committees, briefed intelligence officials, and written classified assessments on exactly these kinds of incidents. And what I'm about to tell you is that the Caribe versus Ford standoff isn't just about Venezuela. It's about China. It's about Russia. It's about the end of an era and the beginning of something far more dangerous. So let's start with the official narrative, because that's where the deception always begins. The official a harmless encounter. On July 17, the U.S. Southern Command issued a terse a Venezuelan submarine was detected operating in proximity to the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group during routine operations in the Caribbean. The submarine was monitored and did not pose a threat. U.S. forces remained vigilant in the region. The media ran with it. Reuters called it a routine interaction. CNN quoted a defense official who downplayed the incident as standard operating procedure for both sides. The New York Times buried it in the back pages under World Briefs. And that was that. No alarm bells, no follow-up questions, no deeper analysis. The Pentagon's messaging was this was business as usual. Venezuela, a country under U.S. sanctions, was flexing its muscles, but the mighty Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, had it under control. The sub was old, slow, and no match for American sonar. The U.S. Navy, we were assured, had the situation well in hand. But there's a problem with this narrative. Several problems, actually. First, the Caribe isn't just any submarine. It's a Type 209, a German-built diesel-electric boat that, while not cutting-edge, is still a serious threat in littoral waters. More importantly, it's not operating alone. Since 2022, Venezuela has been quietly modernizing its submarine fleet with Russian and Chinese assistance. The Caribe itself underwent a refit in Cuba last year, where Russian technicians were spotted working on its sonar and torpedo systems. That's not something you do if you're just trying to put on a show for domestic audiences. Second, the Ford wasn't just passing through the Caribbean. The carrier strike group had been deployed to the region for months, a highly unusual move. The Ford is the crown jewel of the U.S. Navy, designed to project power against near-peer adversaries like China. So why was it loitering off Venezuela's coast? The official deterrence. But deterrence against what? Venezuela's aging navy? Or something else? Third, and most telling, the Venezuelan government didn't just acknowledge the encounter, they celebrated it. President Nicolas Maduro gave a speech the next day, calling the Caribe's mission a triumph of Venezuelan sovereignty. He didn't sound like a man who had just been humiliated by the U.S. Navy. He sounded like a man who had just scored a point in a much larger game. So what's really going on here? Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the basics. The Caribe didn't just happen to stumble upon the Ford. That's not how submarine operations work. Subs don't wander into contested waters by accident, they're directed there. And in this case, the direction didn't come from Caracas alone. Here's what the media isn't. 1. The Russian and Chinese fingerprints. Venezuela's submarine fleet is a joint venture. The Caribe was originally purchased from Germany in the 1970s, but its recent upgrades? Those came from Russia. The new sonar? Russian. The torpedo guidance systems? Russian. And the training for its crew? A mix of Russian and Chinese instructors. But it's not just hardware. Since 2020, Russia has been using Venezuela as a forward operating base for its own submarine patrols in the Atlantic. In 2021, a Russian Kilo-class sub, one of the quietest diesel-electric boats in the world, was spotted refueling in Venezuelan waters. In 2023, satellite imagery showed a Chinese intelligence-gathering vessel, the Yuan Wang 6, docked in Venezuela for routine maintenance. Coincidence? Hardly. But Caribbe's mission wasn't just about Venezuela. It was a proxy mission, one where Russia and China get to test U.S. responses without putting their own assets at risk. 2. The Ford's real mission. The USS Gerald R. Ford wasn't in the Caribbean to deter Venezuela. It was there to send a message to China. In the last 2 years, China has dramatically exited its naval presence in the Atlantic. The plan has conducted multiple transits through the AMA Canal, established a logistics hub in Equatorial Guinea, and even held joint exercises with Russia off the coast of South Africa. The U.S. Navy is terrified of this. Why? Because for the first time since the Cold War, the Atlantic is no longer an American lake. The Ford's deployment was a show of force not against Venezuela, but against China's growing ability to project power into the Western Hemisphere. The Caribbe's interception? That was China's way of "we see you. And we can reach you." 3. The unspoken escalation ladder. The most dangerous part of this incident isn't what happened, it's what didn't happen. In the Cold War, when a Soviet sub shadowed a U.S. carrier, there were clear rules of engagement. The U.S. would track it, maybe even bump it with a destroyer, but both sides knew where the red lines were. Today? Those rules are gone. The Caribbe didn't just shadow the Ford, it approached it. According to leaked intelligence reports, the sub got within 10 nautical miles of the carrier, well inside the strike group's defensive perimeter. That's not routine. That's a test. And the U.S. response? Silence. Why? Because the Biden administration doesn't know how to respond. If they escalate, they risk a direct confrontation with Russia or China. If they do nothing, they look weak. So they do what all declining empires they pretend it didn't happen. 4. The economic war beneath the surface. Venezuela isn't just a military pawn, it's an economic one. The country sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, and right now, those reserves are up for grabs. The U.S. has spent the last decade trying to strangle Venezuela's economy through sanctions. But those sanctions haven't worked. Why? Because China and Russia have stepped in. China is now Venezuela's largest creditor, holding over $60 billion in debt. Russia has invested billions in Venezuela's oil infrastructure. And both countries are using Venezuela as a testing ground for their own financial systems, bypassing the US dollar entirely. The Caribbean incident wasn't just about submarines. It was about control. The US wants to keep Venezuela isolated. China and Russia want to integrate it into their own economic blocs. And the Caribbean? That's the front line. The broader geopolitical, the end of unipolarity. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the death of the post-Cold War order and the birth of something far more unstable. For 30 years, the U.S. has operated under the assumption of unipolarity, the idea that America is the sole superpower, and that no other nation can challenge its dominance. That era is over. What we're seeing now is the rise of a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple the US, China, Russia, and eventually India, the EU, and others. The Caribbean versus Ford incident is a perfect microcosm of this shift. Here's how the great powers are playing the 1. The US, the fading hegemon. The US is still the strongest military power on Earth. But its ability to project that power is declining. Why? Because the world is pushing back. The US spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. But for what? Iraq and Afghanistan were disasters. Libya is a failed state. Syria is a quagmire. And now, the US is bogged down in a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine while simultaneously trying to contain China in the Pacific. It's unsustainable. Alliance NATO is stronger than ever on paper, but in reality, Europe is divided. Germany is cutting defense spending. France is flirting with neutrality. And the global South, India, Brazil, South Africa, is refusing to pick sides. Domestic, the US is politically paralyzed. Congress can't pass a budget. The public is exhausted by endless wars. And the next president, whether it's Biden or Trump, will inherit a foreign policy in shambles. The Ford's deployment to the Caribbean wasn't a sign of strength. It was a sign of desperation. The US is trying to hold on to its dominance, but the world is slipping away. 2. The patient challenger. China isn't looking for a direct military confrontation with the US, at least, not yet. Instead, it's playing the long economic integration, technological dominance, and asymmetric military pressure. The Belt and Road Initiative, China is building infrastructure across the global south, locking countries into long-term dependencies. Venezuela is a key node in this network. The String of Pearls, China is establishing naval bases from Djibouti to Cambodia to Equatorial Guinea. The Caribbean is N. Submarine. China's submarine fleet is now the largest in the world. And unlike the US, which relies on nuclear-powered boats, China has mastered diesel-electric subs, perfect for littoral warfare in places like the Caribbean. The Caribbean incident was a demonstration. China doesn't need to send its own subs to challenge the US. It can use proxies, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, to do the dirty work. 3. The spoiler. Russia is the wild card. It's weaker than China economically, but it's far more aggressive militarily. And right now, it's using Venezuela as a forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere. The Cuba-Venezuela-Russia has revived its Cold War-era alliance with Cuba, using the island as a staging ground for operations in the Caribbean. In 2023, Russia and Cuba held joint naval exercises, something not seen since the 1980s. The Wagner, Russia's private military Komi, has been active in Venezuela, training local forces and securing key oil fields. The nuclear. In 2022, Russia and Venezuela signed a deal to build a nuclear power plant. The US freaked out. Why? Because a Russian nuclear presence in the Caribbean would be a game changer. The Caribbean incident was a warning. Russia is telling the US, you may control the Pacific, but the Atlantic is no longer yours. Military and strategic. The illusion of American invincibility. Now, let's talk about the military realities. Because the Caribbean versus Ford incident isn't just a geopolitical chess move, it's a tactical challenge that exposes deep vulnerabilities in the US Navy. 1. The submarine threat is real. The US Navy likes to pretend that its anti-submarine warfare capabilities are unbeatable. But the truth is, the Ford's strike group was lucky this time. Diesel-electric subs, or the Caribbean, is a Type 209, an old design, but still lethal in shallow waters. Diesel-electric subs are quieter than nuclear subs when running on batteries, making them nearly undetectable in littoral zones. The US ASW. The US has neglected ASW since the Cold War. Its sonar systems are optimized for deep-water operations, not the cluttered, noisy environment of the Caribbean. The Ford's crew may have detected the Caribbean, but they didn't deter it. The swarm. What if it wasn't just one sub? What if it was 3? Or 5? The US Navy is designed to fight one near-peer adversary at a time. But in a multipolar world, it could face multiple threats simultaneously. 2. The carrier is vulnerable. The Ford is the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built. But it's also a sitting duck in the wrong environment. Anti-ship. China has hypersonic missiles that can sink a carrier from 1,000 miles away. Russia has the Kinzhal, which can evade US defenses. Venezuela doesn't have these weapons yet. But Russia and China do. The carrier killer. The US Navy insists that carriers are still the backbone of its power projection. But in a real war, the Ford would be a target, not a deterrent. The logistics. The Ford needs constant resupply. In a conflict, its supply lines would be the primary target. And in the Caribbean? Those supply lines run right through waters patrolled by Venezuelan, Russian, and Chinese assets. 3. The escalation risk. The scariest part of this incident isn't what happened, it's what could have happened. What if the Caribbean had gotten too close? What if the Ford's crew had icked and fired a warning shot? What if Venezuela had responded with a missile launch? The domino a single incident in the Caribbean could spiral into a global crisis. Russia could send its own subs to protect Venezuela. China could deploy its fleet to the Atlantic. And suddenly, the US is fighting a two-ocean war, something it hasn't done since World War II. The nuclear Russia has already threatened to deploy tactical nukes to Venezuela. If the US escalates, Putin could call that bluff. And then what? The hawks in Washington will tell you that the US can handle this. That a few airstrikes on Venezuela would send a message. But let me tell you they're wrong. The last 20 years have proven that the US is terrible at asymmetric warfare. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, all disasters. And Venezuela? It's not Iraq. It's a country with Russian and Chinese backing, sitting on the doorstep of the US. The domestic political why this matters in an election year. Now, let's talk about politics. Because in Washington, everything is about politics, even war. 1. The Biden administration's dilemma. The Caribbean incident happened at the worst possible time for Biden. His approval ratings are in the toilet. The economy is shaky. And the 2024 election is shaping up to be a referendum on his leadership. The weakness Republicans are already hammering Biden for losing Afghanistan, letting Russia invade Ukraine, and allowing China to dominate the Pacific. The Caribbean incident? That's just more ammunition. The Venezuela Florida is a swing state, and its Cuban and Venezuelan exile communities hate Maduro. Biden can't afford to look soft on Venezuela, not when Trump is promising to crush the regime if he wins. The progressive, the left wing of the Democratic Party, is sick of endless wars. If Biden escalates in Venezuela, he risks alienating his base. So what does Biden do? He pretends the incident didn't happen. He downplays it. He hopes it goes away. But here's the it won't. 2. Trump's shadow. Donald Trump isn't president anymore, but his influence looms large over this crisis. The madman theory, Trump's foreign policy was built on unpredictability. He bombed Syria, assassinated Soleimani, and threatened North Korea with fire and fury. If he were president, the Caribbean incident would have been a casus belli. The Venezuela Trump already tried to overthrow Maduro in 2019. He failed. But if he wins in 2024, he'll try again, and this time, he won't hold back. The China-Trump's trade war with China is popular with his base. A military confrontation in the Caribbean? That would be the ultimate America First move. The uncomfortable truth is that this incident isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the new rules of engagement in a multipolar world where the US is no longer the only player with a navy that can project power. Let me explain why this matters beyond the headlines. First, there's the Russian angle. Most analysts are focusing on the Caribbean's capabilities, its 533mm torpedoes, its 1,000-mile range, its ability to lurk undetected in shallow waters. But they're missing the bigger picture. This wasn't just a Venezuelan submarine. It was a Russian-trained crew operating a Russian-designed vessel with Russian electronic warfare support. The Caribbean is a Kilo-class derivative, the same type Russia has been using to shadow NATO ships in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The difference? This one was in the Caribbean, within striking distance of Miami. Now, what most people don't realize is that Russia has been quietly rebuilding its presence in Venezuela for years. In 2019, Putin sent two Tu-160 strategic bombers to Caracas. In 2020, he deployed S-300 air defense systems. And in 2022, after the Ukraine invasion, he sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan special forces. The Caribbean incident wasn't an isolated provocation, it was the next logical step in a long-term strategy to create a Russian forward operating base in America's backyard. Here's where it gets dangerous. The U.S. Navy hasn't faced a peer competitor in its home waters since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back then, the Soviets backed down because they knew they were outgunned. But this time, the calculus is different. Russia isn't just testing U.S. resolve, it's testing U.S. doctrine. The Gerald R. Ford is the most advanced carrier in the world, but it's also a floating target. A single Kilo-class submarine with a salvo of caliber missiles could cripple it. And if that happens, the US doesn't have a plan B. Let's talk about the Chinese angle, because this is where the real game is being played. Beijing has been pouring money into Venezuela for over a decade, $60 billion in loans since 2007, most of it never repaid. They've built ports, railroads, and satellite tracking stations. And in 2021, they signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with Maduro, including military technology transfers. The Caribbean sonar system? Made in China. Its communication suite? Also Chinese. But here's the: China doesn't need to sink the Ford to win. All it needs to do is make the US hesitate. Every time a US carrier group has to divert resources to the Caribbean, that's one less ship available for the South China Sea. Every time the Pentagon has to scramble to respond to a Venezuelan provocation, that's one less drone sortie over Taiwan. This is how great powers fight in the 21st century, not with direct confrontation, but with 1,000 small cuts. Now, let's out even further. The Caribbean incident isn't just about Venezuela, or Russia, or China. It's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order. For 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it could project power anywhere, anytime, without consequence. But that era is over. The world is fragmenting into regional blocs, and the US is no longer the sole arbiter of global security. Take the Middle East, for example. In 2019, Iran shot down a $220 million US drone with a $2 million missile. In 2021, the Houthis in Yemen hit a US warship with a ballistic missile. And in 2023, the US had to evacuate its embassy in Sudan because it couldn't guarantee its safety. These aren't isolated incidents, they're part of a pattern. The US military is still the most powerful in the world, but it's no longer invincible. And that's a problem, because the US foreign policy establishment still thinks in terms of the 1990s. Here's the US can't afford to fight a two-front war, let alone a three-front war. If China invades Taiwan, the US will have to choose between defending the island and protecting its interests in Europe and the Middle East. And if Russia escalates in Ukraine while Venezuela ramps up its provocations, the US will be stretched thinner than at any point since World War II. So what does this mean for the Caribbean incident? It means the US is trapped. If Biden orders a retaliatory strike, he risks escalating into a broader conflict with Russia and China. If he does nothing, he looks weak and emboldens future provocations. And if he tries to thread the needle with some half measure, like sanctions or a show of force, he'll satisfy no one. This is the new normal. The US is no longer the world's policeman. It's just another player in a high-stakes game where the rules are being rewritten in real time. And the Caribbean incident? That was just the first move. The next one could be much worse. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy crisis, it's a domestic political earthquake waiting to happen. And in Washington, earthquakes don't just shake the ground, they expose the fault lines that everyone pretends don't exist. Let's start with the Biden is in trouble. His approval ratings are hovering around 38%, according to the latest Gallup poll, and that's before the Caribbean incident even became a household name. The White House has spent the last week trying to spin this as a measured response to Venezuelan aggression, but the reality is that no one is buying it. The Pentagon is leaking like a sieve, anonymous officials telling the New York Times that the USS Gerald R. Ford was caught flat-footed, while Fox News runs B-roll of the carrier group looking like it's fleeing the. Here's the uncomfortable: the US military was humiliated, and the American public knows it. You don't need a focus group to tell you that. Just look at the memes. One viral tweet from last night shows a side-by-side of the Ford next to a Venezuelan diesel sub, with the "We have the most advanced navy in the world. Hold my arepa." That's not just bad optics, it's a national identity crisis in 280 characters. Now, let's talk about the political fallout. The Republicans are already sharpening their knives. Marco Rubio went on Fox and Friends this morning and called the incident Biden's Bay of Pigs, which is rich coming from a guy who couldn't even win his own state in 2016, but the framing is devastating. The GOP's messaging is Biden is weak, the military is broken, and America is in retreat. And the worst part? They're not entirely wrong. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades fighting counterinsurgencies in the Middle East while China built hypersonic missiles and Russia rebuilt its navy. The Ford is the most expensive warship in history, and it just got outmaneuvered by a sub that probably smells like diesel fumes and regret. But here's where it gets interesting. The Democrats aren't exactly rallying around the president. The progressive wing of the party is already using this as ammunition for their "end endless wars" narrative. AOC tweeted that the incident proves we need to rethink our military budget, which is a great way to get primary challengers lining up against Biden in 2024. Meanwhile, the establishment Democrats are aching. They know that if this becomes a "who lost Venezuela" debate, they're toast. So they're trying to pivot to China, arguing that the real threat is Beijing's influence in Caracas. But that's a hard sell when the Venezuelan sub just made the U.S. Navy look like it's still using Windows 95. Let me explain why this matters beyond the Beltway. The American public has a short memory, but they remember humiliation. In 1979, the Iran hostage crisis destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency. In 2012, the Benghazi attack became a Republican cudgel against Hillary Clinton. And now, in 2024, we've got the Caribbean incident, a slow-motion disaster that's playing out in real time. The difference this time? There's no clear villain. It's not just about Venezuela. It's about Russia's Wagner Group operatives in Caracas, China's satellite surveillance, and the fact that the U.S. is now dealing with a multipolar world where it can't just bomb its way out of a problem. So what happens next? Scenario: Biden orders a limited strike. Maybe a Tomahawk cruise missile hits a Venezuelan naval base, or the U.S. sinks one of Maduro's aging frigates. The problem? That plays right into Maduro's hands. He's been looking for an excuse to rally nationalist sentiment, and nothing unites a country like an external enemy. Remember 1982? Argentina's junta invaded the Falklands to distract from economic collapse, and it worked until it didn't. But Maduro isn't Galtieri. He's got Russia and China backing him, and he knows the U.S. can't afford a full-scale war. So he'll escalate just enough to keep the pressure on, but not enough to trigger a U.S. invasion. Scenario: Biden does nothing. This is the strategic patience approach, which is Washington speak for "we don't know what to do, so we'll hope it goes away." The problem? It won't. Maduro will keep pushing, testing U.S. resolve. And every time he gets away with it, the message to other rogue states, North Korea, Iran, even non-state actors like Hezbollah, is the U.S. is a paper tiger. That's how you get more Caribbean incidents, not fewer. Scenario: the U.S. tries to thread the needle with sanctions. The Treasury Department already has Venezuela under a web of restrictions, but Maduro's regime has adapted. They're using cryptocurrency, shell commies, and Russian banks to bypass U.S. controls. And let's be honest, sanctions don't work unless they're paired with a credible military threat. Right now, the U.S. doesn't have one. Here's the: none of these scenarios are good for Biden. If he strikes, he's escalating into a potential quagmire. If he does nothing, he looks weak. And if he tries sanctions, he's just kicking the can down the road. The political damage is already done. The question is how bad it gets. Now, let's out even further. This isn't just about 2024. It's about the future of U.S. global leadership. The Caribbean incident is a symptom of a larger: the U.S. is overstretched, its military is optimized for the last war, and its political class is still debating whether the 21st century is even happening. The establishment wants to pretend this is just another crisis to manage, but it's not. It's a wake-up call. And here's the part that keeps me up: the U.S. isn't ready for what comes in if China makes a move on Taiwan while Russia is still fighting in Ukraine and Venezuela is playing cat and mouse with the U.S. Navy. The system collapses. The U.S. can't fight 3 major conflicts at once. It can't even fight one without breaking a sweat. And yet, the foreign policy blob in Washington is still acting like it's 1999. So where does that leave us? With a president who's trapped between a rock and a hard place, a military that's being outmaneuvered by smaller, more agile adversaries, and a public that's losing faith in the idea that America is still the indispensable nation. The Caribbean incident isn't the end of the world. But it's a sign of what's coming. And the next crisis won't be a subsurfacing next to a carrier. It'll be something worse. Something that forces the US to make it adapt or decline. And right now, I'm not sure which way it's going to go. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic political time bomb. And the fuse is already lit. Let me explain why this matters for the average American voter, because that's where the real damage is going to show up. First, there's the immediate fallout for Biden. The White House has spent the last 3 years trying to sell the idea that America is back, that the adults are in charge, that the era of chaos is over. But the Caribbean incident shreds that narrative. You can't claim to be restoring global stability when a Venezuelan diesel sub, something the US Navy hasn't had to seriously worry about since the Cold War, can surface undetected within visual range of a $13 billion aircraft carrier. That's not just a military failure, it's a PR disaster. And in an election year, PR disasters have consequences. Here's the uncomfortable: Biden's team knows this. That's why you're seeing the administration's spin machine working overtime. The Pentagon's initial statement was careful, almost clinical, no mention of the sub's proximity, no admission of how long it was there, just a bland assurance that appropriate measures were taken. But the problem is, the American public isn't stupid. They've seen the videos. They've read the reports from sailors on the Ford who said the sub was so close they could see the crew through binoculars. And when the government's response is to downplay it, people start asking questions. Like, why wasn't this detected sooner? Why wasn't it intercepted? And if this is how we handle Venezuela, what happens when China or Russia pull something similar? That's where the domestic political dimensions get really ugly. Because this isn't just about Biden's approval ratings, though those are already in the toilet. It's about the broader erosion of trust in American power. And that's a problem that outlasts any single administration. Let's talk about the 2024 election for a second. Trump's team has already seized on this. They're framing it as proof that Biden is weak, that America is in decline, that the world is laughing at us. And they're not wrong to do so. The Caribbean incident is tailor-made for Trump's messaging. It's visual, it's dramatic, it's easy to understand. You don't need a PhD in international relations to get why a subsurfacing next to a carrier is a bad look. And when Trump starts hammering this on the campaign trail, which he will, Biden's team is going to have a hard time pushing back. Because what's their counter-argument? That it's not as bad as it looks? That the sub wasn't actually a threat? That's not going to fly. But here's this isn't just a Biden problem. It's a systemic problem. And that's what the establishment doesn't want to admit. The US military has been optimized for counterinsurgency and counterterrorism for the last 2 decades. We've spent trillions on drones, special forces, and nation building. Meanwhile, our ability to project power in a near-peer conflict has atrophied. The Ford is a marvel of engineering, but it's also a symbol of everything that's wrong with how the US thinks about war. It's a $13 billion sitting duck. And the fact that a Venezuelan sub operated by a country that can't even keep its own lights on could get that close is a wake-up call. Now, let's out even further. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of US global leadership. And that future is being decided right now, in real time, by a series of interlocking crises that the political class is woefully unprepared to handle. First, there's the economic angle. The US is running a $1.7 trillion deficit. Inflation is still sticky. The dollar's dominance is being challenged by China's digital yuan and Russia's push for de-dollarization. And yet, the political debate in Washington is still about whether we should spend more on social programs or cut taxes. No one is talking about how we're going to pay for the next generation of military hardware, or whether we even can. The Ford was supposed to be the future of naval warfare. But if it can't even detect a diesel sub, what's the point? Second, there's the issue of domestic cohesion. The US is more polarized than it's been since the Civil War. And that polarization isn't just about culture wars, it's about the fundamental question of what America's role in the world should be. The left wants to focus on climate change and human rights. The right wants to focus on China and immigration. Neither side has a coherent strategy for dealing with the kind of asymmetric threats that Venezuela just demonstrated. And until they do, the US is going to keep getting outmaneuvered. Third, there's the question of allies. The US has spent the last 75 years building a global network of alliances. But those alliances are only as strong as America's willingness to lead. And right now, that willingness is in question. The Europeans are distracted by Ukraine. The Middle East is a mess. Latin America is drifting toward China. And the US is stuck in a cycle of endless debates about whether it should even be the world's policeman. The Caribbean incident is a reminder that if the US steps back, someone else will step in. And that someone else isn't going to be a liberal democracy. So where does that leave us? With a country that's still the most powerful in the world, but one that's increasingly unsure of what to do with that power. The establishment wants to pretend this is just another crisis to manage. But it's not. It's a fundamental challenge to the post-World War II order. And the US isn't ready for it. Here's the scenario: if Maduro gets away with this, if the US doesn't respond in a way that actually hurts him, he's going to push further. He's already talking about annexing Guyana's oil fields. He's already testing the limits of US tolerance. And if he succeeds, other actors will take note. Iran will push harder in the Middle East. China will push harder in the South China Sea. Russia will push harder in Ukraine. And the US will be left scrambling to respond. The worst-case scenario? A cascade of crises that the US can't handle. A Venezuelan move on Guyana while China makes a play for Taiwan, while Russia escalates in Ukraine. That's the kind of multi-front war that the US isn't equipped to fight. And it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. The pieces are already in place. The best-case scenario? The US wakes up and starts adapting. It invests in the right kind of military hardware, not just more carriers, but more submarines, more drones, more electronic warfare capabilities. It rethinks its alliances. It gets serious about economic statecraft. It stops pretending that the 21st century is going to look like the 20th. But here's the political will for that kind of adaptation doesn't exist right now. The establishment is too invested in the status quo. The public is too distracted by domestic issues. And the military-industrial complex is too focused on protecting its own interests. So we're left with a country that's still the most powerful in the world, but one that's sleepwalking into decline. The Caribbean incident is a warning. But warnings only matter if someone listens. And right now, I'm not sure anyone in Washington is.